My mother idolized my brother, but acted as if I were a curse. I pushed back, and her life began to unravel. Growing up, I quickly learned one thing. If something went wrong, I'd take the blame. It didn't matter what it was. If the wrong type of milk was in the fridge, if a bill wasn't paid, or if Jason, my younger brother, got a bad grade, my mom would always find a way to pin it on me. This never changed. Somehow, I was always the reason for every family problem, no matter how disconnected I was from the situation. At 28, you'd think I'd be used to it by now, but I wasn't. That evening was no different. After work, I stood in the kitchen, drained, staring at a pile of bills on the table. My job barely paid my own expenses, but I still tried to help when I could. Jason, now 24, had never needed to stress over things like this. He was the favored one, the flawless son in my mother's eyes. As expected, my mom, Deborah, entered the room, sighing dramatically, signaling she was about to start something. "Karen," she snapped, "why do you keep buying this cheap cereal? You know Jason doesn't eat this brand." I glanced at the box on the counter. It was the same one we always bought. Somehow this week it wasn't good enough. "It was on sale," I replied evenly. "I'm trying to save money." She scoffed, shaking her head in exasperation. "Oh, of course. You think saving a few bucks is more important than getting what your brother likes." I clenched my jaw, knowing it wasn't worth arguing. It never was. She grabbed a glass from the cupboard and continued, "By the way, he's been stressed about that job interview. I don't know why you had to fill his head with all those ideas and make him anxious." I blinked in confusion. "I was helping him. He asked me for advice." "You probably overwhelmed him," she shot back. "You always have to interfere, never thinking before you speak. And now, look, he didn't get the job." My stomach sank. Jason had told me himself the interview went well, but I knew that wouldn't matter to her. It was easier to blame me than face the fact that maybe he wasn't a fit for the job. "Maybe it wasn't meant to be," I said calmly. Deborah gave me a cold, sarcastic smile. "Right, because nothing ever has anything to do with you, does it?" I didn't answer. I'd spent my whole life fighting this battle, defending myself, trying to get her to see reason. But the truth was, she didn't want to see it. Admitting I wasn't to blame would mean taking responsibility, and that wasn't in her nature. Instead of wasting more breath, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The night air bit at my skin as I stood there on the quiet Chicago street, just breathing. This wasn't just a bad day, it was the story of my life. Memories came flooding back, especially the one when I was 12, right after my parents' divorce. Even then, my mom made sure everyone believed I was the difficult one. She told our relatives my attitude stressed my father out, that I was why things fell apart. Never mind the screaming matches between her and my dad. Never mind that I was a kid trying to understand why my family was breaking apart. Nothing had changed since then. And as I stood on that cold sidewalk, I knew something had to. This wasn't just one fight, it was a pattern. Patterns could be broken. I went back inside, mind racing, and silently headed to my room. I shut the door, pulled out a notebook, and began documenting everything. Every instance where she twisted facts to make me look bad. Every time she blamed me for things I had no connection to. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't let her get away with it anymore. For the next few weeks, I kept detailed records. But I knew memories alone wouldn't be enough. Jason had spent his life believing everything she told him, and most of my relatives either ignored or accepted her behavior. To break this cycle, I needed proof. The opportunity came faster than expected. One afternoon, my dad, Richard, called and asked if I could help him sort through old paperwork. He had downsized to a smaller place and was clearing out years of clutter. I agreed, eager to spend time with him. When I arrived, he had several dusty boxes filled with tax records, medical bills, and other documents. We spent an hour sifting through them, discarding what he no longer needed. That's when I found it, a thick folder labeled Education Fund. Hesitating, I opened it. Inside were records of deposits and withdrawals related to Jason's college expenses. The numbers didn't add up. I showed the folder to my dad, trying to sound steady. "Do these amounts look right to you?" He frowned, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the pages. His expression hardened. "This doesn't make sense. Your mom handled these payments. I trusted her." I pointed to a series of large withdrawals. "Jason said his tuition was covered, but these amounts are way too high. And look, There's a $5,000 withdrawal right before vacation. Another before she bought her new car. My dad rubbed his temples, looking drained. You think she used the money for herself? He asked, though he already knew the answer. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jason, how much he idolized and trusted her. I needed to talk to him, but had to tread carefully. If I pushed too hard, he'd shut down and defend her. The next day I asked him to meet up. At the cafe, he stirred his coffee and said, Mom's been tense lately. She thinks you're stirring up drama again. I almost laughed. I just have a question, I said casually. How much did your tuition cost, roughly? He shrugged. Maybe $20,000 to $25,000 a year, but I had scholarships, so it wasn't even that much. And Mom handled all the payments? Yeah, she always made sure I was taken care of. I pulled up a photo of the folder on my phone. Then how do you explain this? Jason squinted at the screen. As he read, confusion morphed into disbelief. These withdrawals. This isn't all for my tuition. No, I replied softly. For once, he didn't rush to her defense. He didn't accuse me of overreacting. He just sat there stunned. I need to talk to Dad, he finally said. I already did. We both saw the numbers. She lied to us, Jason. He leaned back, rubbing his face. She always said everything she did was for me. She said a lot of things, I responded. But the truth is right here. Jason wasn't ready to accept it, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, my dad called me. I think it's time we confront her, he said. I exhaled. Yeah, it's time. We decided to bring it up at the next family dinner. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't fighting this alone. When the night came, the gathering was at Aunt Michelle's house. From the moment I arrived, tension was palpable. My mom played the perfect hostess, laughing too loudly and making a show of her efforts. Jason sat stiffly on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He nodded at me but stayed quiet, still processing everything. Before I reached the kitchen, I heard my mom's voice rise above the chatter. It's such a shame Michelle couldn't be here tonight. Honestly, I can't blame her. After everything with Karen, who'd want to deal with that drama? I stopped in my tracks. Of course, she'd try something like this. People shifted uncomfortably. My cousin Rachel glanced at me, lips pressed tight. Uncle Dan suddenly found his drink fascinating. I took a deep breath and entered the kitchen. My mom zeroed in on me instantly. Oh, speak of the devil, she said sweetly. We were just talking about how your attitude probably kept Michelle away. I met her gaze. Michelle told me she wasn't feeling well. She RSVP'd earlier. Deborah waved her hand dismissively. Sure, but let's be honest. Your energy hasn't exactly been welcoming. Rachel cleared her throat. Actually, Michelle told me she wasn't coming because she's sick. The atmosphere shifted. My mom's smile froze. Well, she stammered, maybe that's part of it, but you know how sensitive Michelle is. Mom, Jason interrupted, just stop. The room fell silent. Jason never contradicted her, especially in public. What's that supposed to mean, she asked, eyes narrowing. He set his phone down and looked at her. It means stop blaming Karen for everything. You do this all the time. For a moment, she was speechless. Deborah recovered quickly, letting out a bitter laugh. Oh, honey, you don't see what's really going on, do you? She's been turning you against me, hasn't she? Jason sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. No, Mom, I just started paying attention. That response hit her harder than anything else. She opened her mouth to argue, but Rachel spoke up before she could. Honestly, it's exhausting, Rachel muttered. Every time something goes wrong, Karen gets blamed. It's like your automatic response. Deborah's eyes narrowed. Oh, so now you're all ganging up on me? No one answered. The family's awkward silence was all the confirmation she needed. I watched as realization dawned. She wasn't winning this time. Scoffing, she crossed her arms. Fine, she snapped. If you all want to turn against me, go ahead. But don't come crawling back when she stirs up more trouble. Because trust me, it's only a matter of time. She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming a door behind her. The room remained eerily quiet. I felt Jason's eyes on me. When I finally looked at him, something in his gaze had changed. There was no resentment or anger, just regret. I didn't see it before, he said softly. I do now. For the first time in my life, I believed him. A week after the dinner, my dad called me. I'm ready, Richard said. We'll do this at my place. I don't want her causing another scene in front of the whole family, but Jason needs to hear the truth from both of us. I agreed. Jason was still stuck between two realities. The one our mom had built for him and the one he was only now starting to understand. We needed to handle this carefully. That Saturday, Jason and I arrived at Dad's house. He had laid everything out, the transaction records, documents, and notes about the withdrawals. He wasn't taking any chances. He wanted the facts to be undeniable. Deborah arrived 20 minutes late, acting as though this was just a minor annoyance. She walked in with her usual confident air, scanning the room like she expected a party. Her smile faded slightly when she saw the papers on the table. "What's this?" she asked, slipping off her coat and draping it over a chair. Richard didn't hesitate. "It's about Jason's education fund. We need to talk about where the money went." She sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "Oh, for God's sake, Richard. Jason's college was taken care of. Why are we digging this up now?" I watched Jason carefully. His posture was stiff, hands clasped tightly in his lap, and he wouldn't look at her. That was a good sign. Richard slid the papers across the table. "Because the numbers don't add up," he said. "I went through every withdrawal. The amounts you took out don't match Jason's tuition or expenses. Not even close." Deborah barely glanced at the papers. "This is absurd." Jason finally spoke, his voice firm. "Mom, just look." That caught her attention. She studied him, trying to gauge how serious the situation was, then reluctantly picked up the papers. At first, her face stayed neutral, but as she scanned specific transactions, $5,000 before a trip to Florida, another large withdrawal before her car's down payment, and several smaller ones unrelated to Jason's education. Her fingers tensed on the page. "This is out of context," she said tightly. Jason leaned forward. "Then explain it." Her jaw clenched. "There were unexpected expenses. I covered things you didn't know about." Richard folded his arms. "Like what, Deborah?" "Because Jason and I already reviewed his actual tuition costs, and they don't match these withdrawals." She set the papers down with an exasperated sigh. "Oh, please. You really think I was just pocketing money? I was raising 2 kids. I had to make tough choices." "That's exactly what you did," I said, keeping my voice steady. Her head snapped toward me, her expression icy. "Of course, you'd love to play the victim here, wouldn't you?" "I'm not the victim," I replied. "Jason is. You took money meant for his education and spent it on yourself. That's a fact." Jason exhaled sharply, staring at the table. "Mom, did you even use any of this money for me?" Deborah hesitated just a fraction too long. That was all it took. Jason abruptly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor as he stood. "I trusted you," he muttered. "You told me everything was fine, made me feel like I owed you for all the sacrifices you made, and the whole time, you were lying." Deborah rose too, defensive. "I did sacrifice for you. You have no idea how hard it was to keep things together. I had to make tough choices." "You had a choice," Jason interrupted, his voice trembling with anger. "And you chose yourself." She blinked, clearly stunned. For once, she didn't know how to respond. Richard seized the moment. "You need to repay what you took," he said firmly. "We're not letting this go." Deborah laughed bitterly. "You're not serious." Jason turned to her, his hands still shaking. "If you care about me at all, you'll make this right." Silence fell over the room. For the first time, my mom seemed uncertain. But instead of accepting responsibility, she glared at me again. "This is all your fault," she spat. "You've been poisoning Jason against me," whispering in his ear. "You've always been jealous, Karen. Ever since you were a kid, you hated not being the center of attention." Jason let out a humorless laugh. "Are you kidding me? I didn't even listen to Karen for most of my life. I believed you, and you lied." Deborah's gaze darted between us, realizing she'd lost control. Richard's voice cut through the tension. "Deborah, if you don't take responsibility, we'll pursue legal action." Her expression darkened. "You'd really do that to me after everything I've done for this family?" "You didn't do it for the family," I said quietly. "You did it for yourself." Her jaw tightened, fists clenched at her sides. Without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Jason let out a shaky breath and sank back into his chair. "She's never going to admit it, is she?" he muttered. "No," I replied, "she won't." Richard sighed, running a hand over his face. "We'll move forward legally. She's not getting away with this." Jason nodded slowly, exhaustion written across his face. "I'm sorry," he said after a long pause, "for everything." I swallowed hard. We were raised to think she was always right. "It's not your fault." Jason looked at me, really looked at me, and nodded. For the first time in years, we were on the same side. After she stormed out, I knew my mom wouldn't stay quiet. Within days, she started making calls, twisting the story to anyone who'd listen. I noticed how some family members' attitudes changed. Short, curt messages and sudden coldness from previously neutral relatives. Then the accusations began. Aunt Laura called, her voice filled with forced concern. "Karen, your mom told me everything. She said you and your dad ambushed her, accused her of stealing, and threatened to sue. Do you really want to destroy your own mother after all she's been through?" "Destroy her?" I almost laughed. "Laura, do you want to see the bank statements? I can send them to you right now. No stories, just numbers. They don't lie." She hesitated, her silence telling me everything. "You're making this up," she mumbled weakly. "Then why won't she prove me wrong? If I'm lying, it should be easy to show where the money went." Laura sighed. "Send me what you have." I did. That was the turning point. One by one, my mom's loyal supporters began reaching out, quietly asking for the truth. I gave them only the facts, and as the truth spread, so did the anger. I wasn't the only one she had manipulated. One night, my cousin Rachel called, frustration clear in her voice. "You know she borrowed money from me years ago? Said it was an emergency. I found out later she spent it. She had used that money on a luxury hotel stay and never paid me back," Rachel said, her voice tight with frustration. My Uncle Dan had a similar story. She asked me for money after the divorce, claimed it was for Jason's school. Now I'm wondering if any of that actually went to him. With every phone call, with every revelation, my mother's control over the family crumbled. Jason, however, wasn't vocal about it. He wasn't reaching out to defend himself or explain things to others. But I could tell he had changed. A week after our confrontation, he sent me a text out of the blue. "Want to grab coffee?" I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying, "Sure." We met at a small cafe near his apartment. For the first few minutes, we didn't say much. This dynamic, where we weren't on opposing sides, was still new to us. Finally, Jason broke the silence. "She called me last night," he said quietly. "Told me I betrayed her." I nodded. "Figures." "I told her she needed to take responsibility," he continued. "She started crying, saying she gave up everything for us, that she had no other choice." I sipped my coffee. Jason let out a slow breath. For the first time, I didn't believe her. That was when I knew he was truly free. After that, things changed more quickly than I had anticipated. My dad proceeded with legal action, forcing my mom to return as much of the stolen money as possible. She resisted, of course. She played the victim, claiming we were cruel and ungrateful. But the evidence was too strong. The numbers didn't lie. She had to pay back what she could. Yet the true consequence wasn't financial, it was her isolation. Once the truth circulated, most of the family distanced themselves from her. She reached out to those who still spoke to her, inventing new stories and casting herself as the victim again. But the problem with burning bridges is that eventually, you have nowhere left to go. Jason, for the first time in his life, started setting real boundaries. He stopped answering her frantic, late-night calls. He didn't rush to defend her when she played the victim, and he began making an effort to build a relationship with me. It was subtle at first, coffee meetups, the occasional check-in text. Then one evening, he invited me to a game night with his friends. I almost declined. The idea of casually hanging out with him after everything we'd been through felt strange, but I realized I wanted to go. When I did, it wasn't awkward or forced. It felt natural, easy. That's when I knew we were truly moving forward. Family gatherings also changed in ways I hadn't expected. Without my mom stirring up drama, the atmosphere was lighter. People laughed more, stayed longer. It was like a weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. At a cousin's birthday party, I looked around and had a startling realization. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to be on guard. I wasn't bracing for the next verbal attack. I was simply there, part of the family. And my mom wasn't. She did try to intrude once, showing up uninvited. My dad calmly told her that she wasn't welcome unless she respected the boundaries we had set. She stormed out, calling him a traitor as she left. That was the last time she tried. I knew she would continue telling her version of events to anyone who would listen. She would keep casting herself as the misunderstood martyr, rewriting history to make herself seem like the wounded hero. But it didn't bother me anymore. The people who mattered knew the truth, and that was enough. I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore, and I never would again.